I would love to hear like your perspective on vaping specifically as a mechanism. Like, should people be concerned with, huffing on a pen all day long?
Ooh, that's a big first question. I mean, the short answer is yes. The long answer is that of course, there was cigarettes originally, and they had caused a bunch of harm with the tar and tobacco, and we drove those numbers down, thankfully. But for a long time, people have been trying to find safer delivery systems for nicotine, right? And so when Juul came around in 2015, 16, 17, there was some hope that this would be safer, a safer delivery system, and could be a way that we avoid cancer. Maybe that's true for some adults in terms of harm reduction. But what we've seen is that the kids started using it, predisposing them to addiction, I think, or being an initial manifestation of some degree of pain and suffering, and then it took off, and I think it's caused more harm than good overall for sure.
Yeah, because I think originally it was being sold as a safer alternative to smoking cigarettes, and now there's been research that's come out where you'll hear some people say that it's nearly as damaging as cigarettes because of the amount of nicotine people are consuming each and every day through these jewels and pens and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, I think it's safer in terms of like the contaminants that are in it, in terms of the carcinogens that are in tar, and also the way that cigarettes interact with medications. Vapes often don't have that because of some of the hydrocarbons and other things that go into cigarettes. But, what made, Juul was able to create these nicotine salts that could deliver this high amount of nicotine in a smoother way. And then the delivery system allowed you to use it all the time. It sort of was a secretive, you can do it in secret. You don't smell like it. Like when I was a kid, if someone was smoking, you knew they were smoking because there was smoke, and they smelled like it. But now you can do it. You could do it, secretly all the time and get really high doses of nicotine, and that can lead to really bad outcomes, and it can lead to addiction. It can affect the heart and the blood vessels, the endocrine system, and so it's not benign in itself, and the way it can deliver high doses of nicotine is what makes it especially concerning. I agree.
And I think what happens too is people somehow in their minds equate legalization with health. They're like, oh, if it were not safe, then why would it be legal to do? Why could I buy this in every convenience store? Why can I order it online? And we've known that this isn't true when it comes to things like alcohol and THC and stuff, that, there's a lot of health risks that go on that come with like consuming substances like that. And I also think that people will be like, well, I'm not putting a needle in my arm. I'm not like smoking crack. I'm not snorting coke. So like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And the problem, I think, is it's still an addictive substance. So talk about from an addiction perspective, like how does vaping specifically, like what types, like how does that fall into the addiction spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, there. It's not going. I mean, yes, just because something's legal doesn't mean that it's safe. And alcohol and marijuana can potentially cause even more damage to the body and to mental health than nicotine at times. But nicotine is still an incredibly addictive substance. It works on these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that floods the brain with dopamine when they get activated, and then floods the brain with dopamine as well as other neurotransmitters, serotonin, acetylcholine, beta endorphins, and so it does light up the brain. And anytime something lights up the brain, I've heard your other great podcasts on cannabis and on opiates, on benzos. When it lights up the brain, the brain wants more of it, and so it eventually rewires in a way where you're getting this big dopamine spike about acquiring nicotine, and you're using all the time, so you're building tolerance. And as the weeks and months go on, while it maybe helped a little bit initially for concentration and anxiety, it becomes a substance that your brain needs and ends up doing more harm than good as the addiction takes off, as the withdrawal states become brutal to manage, and you're sort of stuck before you know it.
I know you mentioned that like it's a great, it was seen as a great alternative for like carcinogens and the contaminants that may exist in things like tobacco products. But haven't people come out and said there's like an issue with the way that people are inhaling it and like the flavorings and stuff as far as how it impacts your health?
For sure. And so, what makes cigarettes problematic is you burn tobacco and that produces smoke that contains, thousands of chemicals, including tar, carbon monoxide, dozens of carcinogens. And, we know when you smoke cigarettes, you get cancers and lung disease and all sorts of stuff. And your average life expectancy goes down by like 15 years. And so that's why there was this thirst to find the safer alternative. And so vaping doesn't involve combustion where you get all these tars and toxins. You heat up a liquid that contains nicotine, but it also contains, to your point, propylene glycol, other flavorings. And even though no combustion takes place, it's putting other junk in your lungs. And the data is not going to come out. And so this is new too. I mean, this is 7 years old, and as time goes on, we appreciate more the way it damages the lungs. We think it has some of those carcinogens in there that could potentially cause trouble long term, but we don't have the long term data. But we know as we study it more, as we follow folks that are vaping over time, the news isn't going to be good. We have all this great long-term data on cigarettes. As the long-term data comes out on these vape devices, we expect that there's going to be evidence of not only lung disease or impacts on the cardiovasculature, but potentially cancers as well.
Yeah. And do you think the issue with people getting addicted to things like vaping is it because of the amount that they're doing? Like I've seen people like literally like sleep with their vape pens next to them. I mean, is it the quantity of nicotine they're consuming that's leading to them being addicted, or is it the fact that these cartridges in itself are just addictive?
I mean, I think both. I mean, nicotine in itself is, even isolated from cigarettes and vapes, is addictive and it activates the reward pathway. But the mechanism and the way it's socialized and the way it's popular among peer groups does drive it as well. And by the way, there's good news. I mean, when I first formed my youth nicotine program at where I work, we were seeing like 25% of kids vaping in 2019, 2020, and those numbers are down these days to around 5%. And so, and of that, like 5-6%, only a quarter to a half use all the time. And so part of why it became addictive is we didn't realize the harm. Like that's why it's good to have podcasts like this. People didn't realize that it even had nicotine in it at first. And as we've realized that this is also an addictive substance, a cigarette alternative, a nicotine alternative, those numbers have gone. Less people are addicted. But now when people now in 2025 are still vaping and youth are still vaping, it's also often a signal that they have other predispositions to substance use disorders, right? They have mental health issues, the family history of addiction. It can be a signal of other things, mental health and addiction going on as well.
And I've heard the withdrawal from vaping is brutal. Like I've talked to people that have kicked like meth and heroin, and they're like the vaping withdrawal is just as bad. Why is that?
Yeah, some say cigarettes and vaping are harder to quit than those, and it takes like 6 quit attempts on average. We can go through some of the strategies in a minute, but a large part of that is that yes, the withdrawal is brutal. Depression, anxiety, insomnia. People are risking their felonies for smuggling this, smoking on planes, just because they feel so uncomfortable as it leaves their systems. I mean, it's pretty brutal. I don't know if you have experience, with nicotine withdrawal, but it's rough. It's rough, and often as people sort of are withdrawing from other stuff, they don't prioritize it at first, just because that feels like too much to take on as at once as well.
Yeah, I do my best to not speak about things that I don't have like prior knowledge of or experience. And nicotine withdrawal is something I've experienced. Like I was a pack to a pack and a half a day Marlboro Red smoker back in the day. And eventually I shifted to like Marlboro Lights, but I smoked for years. Um, and so I tried to quit before I went to jail like multiple times, couldn't. Then I went to jail and had to quit during the few months I was in there. And then I got out and I was like, oh, I can't do anything else anymore. So I'm at least going to just keep my cigarette habit or restart my cigarette habit. And then I was into fitness. So I was like going to the gym, smoking a cigarette before I went in the gym, then leaving. And I was like, this is weird. You know what I mean? And, and then I just set a goal. I was like, okay, I'm going to run this 5K. And when I'm done the 5K, I'm done, because I knew that if I, gave up the cigarettes again, I saw the impact it had on my lungs when I was in jail. Like you have that, like, I guess it's called black lung or whatever. And you have to like cough up all the stuff that's been in your system forever. And I didn't want to have to go through that while I was training for this 5K. And so I just slowly tapered off cigarettes, over the course of a few months, where it went to a pack a day, to three-quarters of a pack, to a half a pack, to half of a pack. And then I got it down to where it was just a cigarette when I woke up and a cigarette before I went to bed, which is, if you talk to people who have smoked cigarettes, I mean, those are two of the most important times that people like to smoke, is when they get up and before they go to bed. And I was able to quit. And I think what helped me was also having these positive habits in place, where I had other things to stimulate my mind and to get my dopamine system going, so that I wasn't struggling to find something to replace that. And so I totally understand the pain that goes through withdrawing from a substance like nicotine. I also don't think you should use that as justification to keep like taking a hammer and like banging your thumb on the wall. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't give you it's not a justifiable reason, in my opinion, to keep smoking for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and your story is one of real discipline, and we do see that most people actually with substance use, it fades with time as other things that are more rewarding come in. I think that's one of the biggest secrets in addiction, is that as people, most people recover without formal treatment, in fact, and part of it is what you're describing, is that you take up exercise, or you start having a family or work, and the use peaks in people's 20s, but as you develop other things and other coping mechanisms, use can fade in that way. But there are some people, I think, who have genetic predispositions to substance use disorders, have mental health and trauma issues, and it's much harder for them to tolerate the anxiety and withdrawal symptoms. And it's not a matter of discipline. It's just this thing really has their hooks in them, and it feels almost unbearable to tolerate the withdrawal. And in fact, most people that do quit, be it vaping or nicotine, it's been best studied when you're giving them sort of nicotine replacement. I mean, you sort of did that with the cigarettes to help them just ease off it, because it's a really tricky and complicated withdrawal state that can be tough to manage.
I'm totally with you. I think that, we shouldn't stigmatize people for substance use, and that there is a certain amount of people that are genetically predispositioned, to things like addiction. I also think that, because over the years people have equated addiction to being this disease, I think it can trap some people who maybe don't have that genetic predisposition, and maybe they just had trauma they haven't worked through, or environmental stuff, or just poor behavior, or lack of discipline, or whatever it is, that they can feel almost limited in their ability to move forward, because maybe they think they fall into that narrative when they don't. Which I also know that there's plenty of people that have like that predisposition, like you said. And I think it's really important to provide aid and help for people coming off of it, wherever, with whatever works best for them. Discipline, fitness, things like that have worked for me and other people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And I totally understand and respect that. I think
Pausing on that for a
yeah.
second, because it's a good point, and I've heard you sort of tap dance around this disease model of addiction when you're dealing with experts like myself, who you think like that's what they believe. It's the disease model of addiction. It's what we've hammered on in people's minds, and in from the academic side, that it's a disease, and end of sentence. But I do agree with you, actually, that doesn't encompass all that goes into why one develops a substance use disorder. I think there's genes and environment and mental health and trauma, that it's the brain, but it's also learning. It's also a whole bunch of other things. And I think at times I agree that to simplify it to one's genes or the brain disease doesn't do its service. And it also doesn't often resonate with people. And it also makes the answer seem like it's only medical, when in fact it involves all these other domains, spiritual, psychological, environmental, to really tackle substance use.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I have like, I tiptoe around it because I know it's not common, as common for people to kind of come out and say, especially people in your position, who speak more politically correct about addiction and stuff like that, which, I'm not maybe as polished and on that on and speaking in that kind of way, but it's something that I definitely appreciate, understand. I think that it also, when you box somebody into having a disease, I just think it can also make them feel like they don't have control of their life. Like they have this terminal diagnosis that's going to be with them for the rest of their life. And they're like, well, what am I going to do? What can I do about it? Like next to nothing, when there's really a lot people can do regarding it, and being able to heal and better themselves.
Yeah, I think I can give you a good example of that in nicotine. For nicotine, like when we so in 2018, our surgeons who are obsessed with their surgical outcomes were screening kids here for nicotine, and because they know impacts bone healing, and they care about the kids, but they also care about their surgical numbers, and so they're like, oh, we need interventions for these kids who have nicotine use. And so they brought us in, and for some very small percentage that we saw 30 kids in this sort of like pilot nicotine program. For two, three, four, I forget the exact number now. They needed sort of biological interventions. They needed nicotine taper. All of these might have qualified for a nicotine use disorder, nicotine addiction, but only a few needed sort of the biological help to get off of it. Most of them just needed education, restructure the family system, get them into more, meaningful activities, and they were able to quit without it. And, those some we felt really biologically stuck, and others weren't, but we call it the same condition, nicotine use disorder. And so you miss, I think, both who the person is and a bunch of potential interventions when you focus on just sort of the biological aspect of it.
And the part that I wouldn't say it gets me, because again, no judgment. I'm just looking at it as somebody who has mentored a lot of people who have come through addiction and are in recovery, and my own personal experience, and also talking to experts, that at the end of the day, I think addicts want to regain control of their life when they're in recovery. They want to better themselves. They want to, like, quote unquote, heal their brain and change their behaviors. And I think that what happens is people typically are using more than one drug when they're doing it, when they're battling addiction. It's normally like alcohol and cigarettes. It's heroin and weed and cigarettes. It's like a combination of a few things. And people will say, don't quit everything at once, which I honestly, I agree with. I'm like, all right, if you're like putting a needle in your arm, you're snorting coke, and you're smoking cigarettes, like, let's just tackle the important things first.
Right. The thing that's going to kill you potentially right away. Yeah.
However, I still think it's important to address the other thing, because that other thing is addictive as well. And if your goal is to try to break these addictive patterns, then I think long term the goal should be to break all of, or do your best to work on and break free from all of these addictions, not just the ones that are going to kill you in the short term. Like how, what is your position, or what is your feelings around like a time frame, or how somebody should gauge like getting rid of all the substances that they're addicted to?
Yeah, I mean, the general frame is to meet the person where they're at, and to do as much as they feel like they can in the moment. But I think I lean, and I heard you talking to, I think it was Dr. Lemke, about her definition of harm reduction, where it's not an end goal, but sort of something that helps facilitate one to get to the desired outcome, which is often abstinence, or in a place with substances where it's not, causing functional impairment. And I view that thing with nicotine. Like maybe we tackle it less last because these other things are killing them, or ending up in the hospital, or putting them in danger. But let's not forget about it. And many more people, I think, can tackle it right away than, one, they realize, or two, sort of the way we currently do treatment sort of encourages it. Because there's no better time in some ways than when you're inpatient, or in jail, to when you really can't get access to these things, to try to solidify, coming off of these things. And I think sometimes we miss that opportunity just in service of tackling the others. Plus, nicotine use is addictive. It can prime those reward pathways again, can result in anxiety, depression. As we've talked about so far, it's not benign even in the short run necessarily, and then the withdrawal states and the ups and downs of the blood level are going to impact you, whether you recognize it or not.
Right. And I think, the goal with this conversation and the nature of the show and talking about stuff like this is to just, not sugarcoat like the truth of certain things and just kind of give people the no BS truth about subjects like this. And people can do what they want. Like, again, not going to judge anyone if they're going to continue to vape, but I also want people to understand the truth of the fact that it is a highly addictive substance. It is something that, if you're not careful, can lead to other addictions. I think, unfortunately, also people judge people who vape. It's just a stigma, right, that does exist. So you have to just be careful of all these things that do go on. And I also look at like what it's done to kids. And I know that vape use is down, but it's still, kids are still vaping, all the time. I mean, I've heard stories of school bathrooms stinking up, smelling like the vape cartridges and stuff. So it's definitely still there. Talk about the difference and how it impacts somebody who's like 15 versus somebody who's like 25.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. And the data on teens is, I think we touched on it. 25% used back in 2019. Now it's down to 6, 7, but still significant. And about 3 to 4% of middle schoolers are vaping. And actually, the kids in their early 20s seem to be vaping nicotine the most these days. That tends to be 15, 20%. And maybe because they were that group that came around when Juul started, and they've continued it into their 20s. But for kids, they have their developing brain. They're navigating a whole bunch of stressors, including mental health and now technology issues, and it's very easy to get stuck on that when you're struggling, and to be addicted and to end up disrupting your brain development and your path in a way that could be really problematic. I mean, from the beginning, it's the kids we've been worried about, especially because we drove down cigarette use in this group so profoundly. Like, while 6% of adolescents are vaping, like 1% are using cigarettes these days. It's incredible. Like in the 60s, 40 to 50% of people were using, including kids, and now we got that number down to like 1% in kids. And so that, if we can get that vaping number down, we would be really excited. For adults, and so you worry about like the gateway in some ways. It's not classically a gateway drug. There's a lot of, I don't really love that way of describing it, but but it can be an entry point to substance use and addiction. For adults, we do think it's potentially safer than cigarettes. I know it's still addictive, and nicotine could do. We had hopes that it would be a gateway out, like people would quit cigarettes by using vapes, and there's some studies that show that can be helpful. Clinically, that tends not to be the experience. Like, mostly people try to quit cigarettes, end up vaping, and they end up vaping much more nicotine. So even though they're not getting the harmful tars and other contaminants of the cigarettes, they end up using much, much more nicotine, which, as we talked about, carries its own harms and problems. And so that's not a great outcome either. In adults, though, still more smokers than vapors. So it's unlike kids. I think it's like 11% of adults smoke and like 6% vape. And so the hope is that we get all those numbers down with time, because, in the end, you're going to not wish you had vaped or smoked more. And, there's going to be health consequences of all of them.
I think that the reason I've heard that cannabis, for instance, THC, I'm talking about, not CBD, THC specifically, is so bad for kids is because it messes up like your reward system and your brain's developmental system, and your ability to manage stress, your ability to deal with discomfort and pain at a very young age, which can be hard to unlearn because you're just creating these new neural pathways, at such a young age. So I think about that aspect with something like nicotine. I also look at the link between people who use nicotine are typically also potentially also using another drug. So, that could lead into other addictions potentially, at a very young age. And I just think it can be really harmful. And the other thing I was reading in this Time magazine piece about it is that one cartridge of Juul is like a pack of cigarettes or something, which is insane to me. And people are doing multiple cartridges a day, correct?
Right. And so, Juul, it had this nice delivery system with the nicotine salts, and you can put pods in. And, one pod is equal to about a pack of cigarettes. They have different amounts of nicotine cigarettes and the pods, but the amount that's absorbed is similar between a pod of a Juul and a pack or two of cigarettes. But it's so easy to go through these pods. And what made them appealing initially was the flavoring too. So, that add a good flavor and you can really go through it. And so as the regulators cut down on Juul and on the flavors, people turned to the disposables. And the tricky thing about these disposable devices is that each of them contains much, much more product. And you really don't know, like when someone was juuling, you could count their pods and get a sense for how much they're using. These disposables, like a puff bar or one of these things, they can be equivalent to like 5 to 20 packs of cigarettes just in one disposable. And it's a little hard to quantify how much you're going through. Like one thing that you can manage when you're smoking a cigarette is you can count your cigarettes. See, you went through a pack. You're like, oh boy, let me rein this in. Same with the Juul pod. Now with these disposables, you can go sort of all day, all the time. The nicotine salts that the delivery system allows it to come in smoothly, not like the freebase nicotine of cigarettes. And so you just can keep going and going and going. And we even see people present with nicotine poisoning in these settings when they first start using, which we never really see with cigarettes, just because you can get so much in your system. And yeah, so getting a ton of nicotine, obviously cements it as addictive, and you end up in those same hijacking of reward systems and prefrontal cortex in the kids and even in adults as well.
Yeah, I was reading that like vaping is causing like death now in people, which, I never thought I'd be reading like short and like the short term. Like cigarettes obviously have been known to kill people over the long term, but you never heard of people like dying from smoking too many cigarettes at once, right? It's an interesting time we're in.
It's still very rare. I mean, there was this sort of catastrophic lung injury that came around in 2019-20, mainly with the bootlegged vaping of marijuana. It contained this contaminant called vitamin E acetate that in the bootleg ones they were using to like stretch out some of the weed product or thin it out or something like that. And that caused some catastrophic lung injuries right around this time COVID was hitting that got people really concerned and caused some deaths and some really bad outcomes. But still, it's not like opiates or even the accidents you see on alcohol in terms of the risk for death.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely way safer than these other substances, but I still think it doesn't mean we just kick it to the curb and say, let's not talk about it, right? Which is why I wanted to have you on here to have this discussion. And I look back as somebody who's an addict, and I was doing drugs to get a reward, like everybody does. I was snorting a bunch of coke to feel more confident, to improve my self esteem, to feel this massive sense of euphoria. I was putting a bunch of opiates in my nose to numb out, to check out, to get a euphoric rush, to numb the pain, all those things. Weed, I smoked a lot of weed to feel cool, to start to numb the pain, started to sell it to, again, feel cool, be somebody that could be well liked or whatever. I don't get it with the vaping. Like cigarettes, you would get like a massive adrenaline rush, after smoking one, and then eventually it's just a diminishing returns. Like you're not getting the same buzz you get when you first started smoking cigarettes. So I'm curious, like you're an addiction psychiatrist, people come to you, like why is vaping, like what is the allure to vaping? Like why do people love it so much?
It's cool. It can be cool. It's not cool. You can look cool doing it. Leonardo DiCaprio did it, what, at the Golden Globes or something. Like there's a cool way to do it potentially. It's flavorful potentially, which I think a lot of people like. But yeah, I mean, the cigarettes and people that vape, they often find themselves with time asking themselves, why am I continuing this? And part of it is that hook of the nicotine, I think, into the system. And, you know, there comes a point with everyone who smokes where like, ugh, maybe it was cool initially, probably not. But now it's just something I need and I really can't live without. And so most chronic smokers I see, they're their thought is that I just can't live without it, and because it would be too unpleasant to stop, or too it'd be such a big undertaking. And as much as people don't sort of appreciate at times that the vapes can be harmful, I think people don't appreciate that there are actually good treatments to help people stop smoking, cigarettes and nicotine as well. And that sometimes is a barrier for people stopping too, is they don't know what a good exit strategy for themselves would be.
So what do you think is like the most effective way, generally speaking, for people to kind of break free from their vaping addiction?
Yeah, one, you do have to have them believe that, and you have to use your motivational interviewing and provide podcasts like this to let people know they do feel better on the other side. Like, you might feel pretty crappy for the first couple weeks, it's true. You try to mitigate that with some of these strategies I'm about to discuss. But when you get to the other side, it's shown that, after you quit, you have less depression, less anxiety, your sleep improves, your fitness improves, be it vaping or cigarettes. No one says, "I wish I vaped more" on their deathbed. So it's something that people do feel better with if they can get to the other side. And so, when we teach it, we teach doctors and pediatricians now how to help people quit. The first rule of thumb generally, and everyone takes their own version of this, is to like set a quit date. That's sort of like rule, get plan number one. And on the quit date, you're supposed to like smash your vape, get rid of everything, tell everyone in your life, throw the cigarettes away. And then most people need either, and probably both, nicotine replacement to just get their way through the withdrawal, and or medications that can help facilitate quitting. And there are two main ones. One is varenicline, which is a partial nicotine agonist. It's a medication that works on those nicotine receptors that are, begging for something when people quit. And the other is an antidepressant called bupropion or Wellbutrin. And both have been shown to help people quit. And so what you do is you set a quit date. About a week before the quit date, you can start one of the two meds if you're interested in meds. And then typically people taper off nicotine product, often the patch plus or minus the gum, over around 3 to 4 months to sort of just ease out. And then on average, it takes people about 6 quit attempts to, even with meds and replacement, to sort of get to the point where they're stabilized and can move on. But it can be fun potentially. It can be a good challenge to get off it. But for people who have tried to quit and they can't do it on their own, they can't. I think getting some of these meds and nicotine replacement on board, getting a doctor's help could be helpful.
Yeah, I totally support like medication assisted treatment and getting a physician's help if you need to. And I also think that what I've learned from recovering from addiction is that the as challenging as it does seem to defeat something like this, the strength and fortitude and resilience you build by doing so is like something that will stay with you the rest of your life. And it just gives you this huge boost of confidence that you can do hard things. And it doesn't mean you have to go sit in a cold plunge for 5 minutes. It means that like when life happens, you're confident in your ability to like navigate because you proved to yourself that you could do something as hard as like quitting something like vaping.
And just to pause on that, that's 100% the case. And I think part of it is also the value of you. I think people don't really have good models in their mind for what that resilient person who's quit looks like at times. We know that there's more people in recovery in the United States than with active substance use in some measures. People often say, "Why do you go into addiction? No one recovers." That's not true. Most people recover. Like, I think the delta is the greatest among substance use than any other medical condition. Most of other medicine is hanging on for dear life until the person dies. Like, real change is possible with this, with substance use. And when you get to the other side, you feel like you can tackle the world. I mean, it takes such resilience, such guts. And it's great to have models that like you that have shown, hey, look, I can do it. I can thrive. And when people really get there, it feels incredible for them, for me, for their families, for everybody.
Why does it normally take 6 times for somebody to quit nicotine? Like, why is it so hard, do you think?
I think part of it is just the hooks it gets in your brain and how hard withdrawal symptoms are. I think people often try to quit it on their own or are incomplete in terms of treatment. I think it's the availability and the access. I think, you know, you can sort of function on it, or you could completely function on it. And now people are talking about how low dose occasional use can help you even function better. And so, there's a lot of appeal that this is something that you can like get away with, and maybe it's not such a big deal. You can't quite make those arguments in your brain as much with drinking and opiates and harder, quote unquote, harder substances. And so it's a sneaky, son of a bitch. It can sneak right back in before you know it.
It definitely creeps up on you. And, I think that for whatever reason, you tell someone to stop drinking like a bottle of vodka a night, no one will say anything. You tell them to stop putting a needle in their arm, they're not going to say anything. Stop snorting coke, not going to say anything. But the minute you tell them to put down like weed or vaping, it's like, oh my gosh, you just literally told that person that their whole world is over. And obviously, I think it's because they're addicted to it. But I also think there's some like ceremonial thing that comes along with stuff like weed and nicotine that makes it's even harder to quit. Like there's a whole culture around stuff like that.
Yeah, there are true believers. Like I'm a friendly faced addiction psychiatrist that studies the stigma of addiction. I'm like the biggest advocate for meeting people where they're at and harm reduction. And it's part of why I've learned to be so nuanced around. Maybe you want to be just stronger on sort of some of the risk of nicotine is just because, yeah, some people just don't buy it. They're real believers in maybe more in cannabis these days than nicotine like five years ago. But that's tricky to navigate, and it's hard to navigate sometimes. I mean, I'm a provider, but I've also been a family member and a friend. And when you see someone that's really believing in something and they're struggling, and it's sort of obvious that it's hurting them, that disconnect can be really hard to navigate at times.
Totally. And my approach has definitely changed over the years. I used to be the if I can do it, you can do it, just like me mentality, like early on, where it's like just shut up and do the work. And then, you mature and you talk to different people and you realize that that's just not the approach that works for everyone. However, I also think that it's important to hold people accountable and not to not be afraid to be direct and tell them the truth, and also having compassion with that, right? And I think those two things can exist where you're holding someone accountable, you're being direct, you're letting them know that what they're doing is not in line with their goals or where they want to be in their life, while also like understanding how hard it is for them to want to quit and to quit. And outside of the medical intervention piece, like what are some other guardrails people can put in place to help them succeed at recovering from nicotine addiction?
I think addiction in general really hides in silence. And so I think, getting some community around it, letting friends, families know, that helps with accountability as well. There are groups that exist for smoking cessation that can provide good supports. Often nicotine comes with other substances. And so definitely getting concurrent help for those can go a long way. And then definitely addressing mental health issues. I think I mean, one of the things about nicotine use is that it's highly co-occurring with having mental health struggles, anxiety, depression, and so also addressing those, simultaneously can really help people quit. And sometimes that's the primary thing that drives people to quit. They're able to get out of a depression or anxiety, or correct get treatment for trauma. Sometimes those are the ways out for substance use, and not the other approaches.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Are you familiar with Dr. Judd Brewer and his work?
A little bit, yeah.
He was saying that like, and this just emphasizes the importance of like dual diagnosis with mental health, is that, he studies a lot of anxiety, and he said, a lot of it is just habit loops with people. And he'll have somebody who's totally anxious all the time, and they'll be drinking alcohol every day. And he's like, instead of like addressing the anxiety at first, let's address the alcohol. And when you take the alcohol away, I mean, obviously it's not like a one-to-one thing where it just vanishes, but it dramatically like reduces anxiety in people. And I think it's just important to have some level of baseline. I've heard others talk about this too, where it's like get rid of the substance for a period of time to see if like that substance is the very thing that's causing all your mental health issues.
And it's also often very tough to tease apart for people because often the mental health and the substance use developed at a similar time. They were often self medicating at first, but the substance use, while at first it seems to help, I mean that's a seductive nature of drugs in general, is that they do help at first. All the substances help at first. They sort of gradually, make everything worse and make your baseline worse. And so stopping it, does often relieve a lot of this substance-induced anxiety and depression that's resulted on top of whatever, mental health issues you had at the beginning. And then, by the way, learning how to quit a substance provides you a lot of the skills that'll help you dealing with the mental health stuff along the way too. And so it's not either or necessarily. It's, you can target interventions that are addressing substance use, but also learning how to deal with anxiety and depression. And that can include, therapeutic strategies and also medications too.
You have to give somebody like a better offer. I've heard addiction experts talk about this in the past. And I think one of the biggest challenges with recovery, and I've said this multiple times, is like you said, you get into it and the drug feels good, it starts numbing the pain, and then you become addicted to that feeling. And then as a result of addiction, you create a bunch of other problems in your life. And then you get to the point where you need to quit because people aren't quitting. People aren't quitting when life is amazing. People are quitting when they've hit that fork in the road, like, all right, I got to make a change. And now you're taking away the very substance that has been the solution to all their problems for all these years, and at a time where you feel like crap about yourself. And it's like, how do you implement strategies that will boost that person's confidence again, and B, be appealing enough to them that they'll actually do it so that they can like stay away from the drugs and just go on this different path. It's a really tough approach. It's obviously worth it in the long run for a variety of reasons, but I definitely empathize with why it's so hard to quit addiction.
Yeah, and I will say that while rock bottom is often a catalyst to change for a lot of people, I think we've sort of tried to, even for families, we tell them to lovingly support the bottom because rock bottom can be death and jail sometimes. We're trying to also raise people's bottom so that they can change before it gets so bad. And I think one of the biggest barriers to allowing people to change before it gets so bad is just the stigma that exists around it. Families don't talk about it the way they talk about other things. We don't have good and readily accessible treatments for folks. People have been kicked out of schools and families and put in jail for so long that they don't feel like they can even reach out for help until they're forced for help when things are really bad. And so I think addressing that stigma and getting all of us in this mindset that let's get people to change before it's rock bottom. And as I said earlier, I think one of the secrets of addiction is that most people do actually change before things get so bad and need interventions. And so people can do it, but it'd be nice if we had a little more supports to help them get there.
So would you recommend like support groups, like is there a 12-step program specifically for people who are trying to quit vaping and nicotine? And like, do you also recommend things like physical fitness and activities like that can help rebuild people's health and overall version of and their overall self-esteem and stuff like that?
First on physical fitness, I think, folks like, Peter Attia and Eric Topol and so many other folks have really emphasized the importance of exercise for all these chronic health conditions that we're battling in the United States: obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. But equally, we need to emphasize it as a solution for folks with substance use disorder. And I think folks in my chair often don't do a good enough job of really recommending it as doctors' sort of orders that exercise and being fit and healthy goes a long way to being physically healthy, emotionally healthy, and certainly getting control over substance use disorders and repairing a lot of what goes on from that. So that's a big part of what I recommend that I think is not recommended enough. But for someone coming, I'd like to let them know that there's a menu of options, that there's support groups, there's medications, there's addressing your mental health, there's involving your family and getting them support, there's online resources, there's a whole menu of options. Now let's think about what would be a good fit to try first. And we try it and see if it works and catches. If it doesn't, we try something else. It's an iterative process where we learn about you, we learn about what works. And for some folks, it will be that spiritual awakening and exercise. For other folks, it'll be, finally getting on Chantix and varenicline, and it was like a silver bullet to the nicotine. these Chantix stories. You give someone, they struggle 50 years with nicotine, they get Chantix, and boom, they have no desire anymore. For some folks, it'll be getting that support group. Others, it'll be getting a job or having their first kid, and so you just want to like work out with them, what that looks like for them, modify it with time, and but keep the hope there, and keep trying until you get someone's life and substance use to a place where it's in a better spot.
Any tips on dealing with cravings?
Cravings are hard. Like when you're doing the nicotine taper initially, when it's really bad, we often say we often have people put on pretty aggressive patches. I think people underdose nicotine replacement with it when they're not with a doctor that really knows what they're doing. Sometimes giving people like 21 to 42 milligram patches at first, and then giving sort of nicotine gum, PRN, for cravings. And then the idea is that as you go down on the patch each month over those 4 months, you use less gum when you have craving. You learn to ride the wave. You have less nicotine in your system, and you build some of those skills on sort of letting slowly saying no to nicotine until it's out of the system. But I also, for all cravings, using meditation and CBT DBT skills, and calling a friend, or you sort of go through all these relapse prevention strategies and find what works for a given person for craving. But you got to expect them, like and be prepared to manage them. That's a big part of addiction recovery.
And I think part of it is people, they associate cravings with meaning that they're still addicted and need to go back and use the substance instead of just accepting the fact that they're part of the process.
Exactly. Like I had, I'm here in New York City, and I had one person that was had the more cravings than I've ever met, and she used to walk from work. She would wake up smoking in her apartment, go downstairs, smoke all the way to Central Park, and then you can't smoke in Central Park with all these public health measures. So she wouldn't smoke, but she would feel so craving. She would feel the craving so intense as she got across the park. She'd smoke as soon as she got on the other side, take all these smoke breaks during the day. And so we had to be so focused to manage her cravings. At first she had to take a taxi to work or drive to work just because she couldn't deal with all these cues as she walked through the park, and had a plan around her breaks at work, sugar-free gum or nicotine replacement, or doing something else, going down getting lunch with a colleague. So you had to manage it all these steps, and then slowly with time they decrease and until she's able to walk across the park and get to work, and manage the breaks, and eventually they do diminish. Sometimes the ones that get you are like these sort of occasional unexpected ones, like you meet a friend at a place you used to smoke, and suddenly it comes flooding in. But mostly it's a gradual process that you're gradually eliminating these things, and tackling it in a way that I think people, if you can view it as sort of fun, I know it's hard to imagine fun, but like a good challenge, like an exercise challenge, sort of, it's like, it's something that we can tackle together, and figure out, that can go a long way.
And so you think framing that, having that framework in general is a good approach for recovering from addiction? See it as a challenge that you're looking to find a way to overcome?
I mean, we've tried to punish the hell out of it for decades, and that's gone nowhere. So, I think viewing it as, yeah, this is your health issue right now, or this is the spot you're in life due to X, Y, Z, or mental health, or trauma, or this thing happened in your life, and it's going to be hard, but very worthwhile to come up with a plan, and to see if we can execute it. And if we can't, we'll figure out a new one as we go through it. And it doesn't mean anything bad about you. It's just where we're at, and I know we can get to somewhere better. So let's see if we can figure this out together. I think that's the attitude I would like families to have. Like, families of kids who are using nicotine are like tackling them at home and screaming at them, and going through their stuff all the time. If you can switch the sort of punishment mentality to one of more sort of reward, encouragement, understand why they're using it, and giving them the tools they need, I think that really helps families as well.
Talk more in depth about that. Like, what can parents do if they come home and they catch their middle school or high schooler vaping and they find they're like addicted to it?
You got to check your own pulse first. I have 3 kids, and I'm like, trained in motivational interviewing, and those kids, they make you want to scream at them sometimes, and I'm guilty of it as much as anyone else. I'll admit to it. It's hard to be a parent. It is hard, but you know if you can sort of take a deep breath, ride your own waves of feelings, and then in a period of calm. I mean, ideally, what they recommend, just to even roll back further, is to start talking to kids about addiction at age 9, like to set the stage early on in families that this is important. And so when the crisis moment comes that you catch them, it's not like you haven't talked about it with them from age 9 until 15 and 16. You should highlight that it's important. But even if you haven't, but if you have, then it makes it more easier. But even if you have, when it's more calm, you talk to them about it, why they're using, what purpose it's serving, what the family values are around it, what they're noticing from their friends. And at times they'll say, leave me alone, whatever. But you set the stage that this is important to you. This will be an ongoing conversation. And you want to help them figure out the why and solutions and be with them through it throughout. If things get really severe, you have to intervene more intensely. But often that sort of softer motivational approach where you're helping them figure it out can go the longest way. And that's one of the big takeaways from that nicotine treatment program I did in 2018 is that I would bring in, it wasn't just the kids coming in, it was kids and parents for the consult. And we would talk about what this looks like for the family to tackle this. And half the time the kids were like, who's this bald guy telling me what to do? But if you can create the right family environment around it, it can really, modify things in a way that can go a long way.
How important is modeling behavior when it comes to kids not being addicted to substances?
I miss, with vaping numbers going down, I'm not invited to the PTA meetings the way I used to be invited. Like in 2018 to 2020, I was in like all the PTA meetings around New York City. Question number one from parents: does this mean I have to stop drinking when I come? Like it was after the vaping presentation. It was always like, do I have to modify my own behaviors? It was 100% guaranteed that would be question number one. And this is where I became sort of rather unpopular, is that I do think yes. Like we can't expect our kids to do things that we're not doing. And I say that, I mean, people have mixed feelings about what their partner, when as they get older, if their partner or other family members drink or not, or use or not. But I do think it is important to have solidarity around improved health behaviors. And if the kid can see, hey, mom and dad, this was a crisis moment for the family, they're vaping, but they took stock that, hey, maybe we're drinking too much. Maybe we have to be mindful of what the kid's looking at in us. I think that I think it does benefit the kids to see their parents making different decisions or just being honest about their risk of substance use or what they've noticed in the family. I think that does go a long way.
Well, John, this combo has been awesome. I appreciate you coming on. Where can my audience find out more about you and your work?
So I'm the vice chair for addiction at Weill Cornell Medicine. You can check us out on our website. We have substance use. What is my website? It's let me find it real quick. It's substanceuesestigma.weill.cornell.edu. We have a lot of resources, supports for families. Coming out with a book next year called Thriving with Addiction as well. That'll encompass some of these sort of strategies for families and my takes on substance use disorder overall. So, stay tuned for good programming that we're putting out in the coming future too.
Awesome. Well, thanks, John, for coming on the pod and for having such a great conversation around something that's really important.
Thanks, Doug. Again, you're great and what you're doing so great. So I really appreciate you having me today.
You got it, man. Thank you.